Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you again for joining us for, as Adele said, the 7th in our series of deep dive around the circle. And this evening is on systems awareness. As you know, we have spent some time in some of the other dimensions, and so this is the second last session of the year and the deep dive around the circle. We have gone through the protocols, as Adele mentioned, that if you have any questions or comments, we will stop along the way and make some space for a bit of dialogue. And then towards the end of the session, we'll also make space for dialogue. And then, of course, I'll be mentioning the last webinar of the series and of the year towards the end of this. So tonight it gives me incredible pleasure to introduce Marion O'Malley. Some of you know Marion. She is the founder of her own organization called FutureWorks. Marion became a TLC practitioner. She certified some 5 years or so, 5.5, 6 years ago now. And Marion very kindly offered to work with us this evening to share her wisdom and her insights into systems awareness. And Marion, would you like to just say a couple of words?
Sure, I'm absolutely delighted to be on this call with you, and I'm really looking forward to exploring systems awareness with you. So great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. For those of you that have been on the webinars before, predominantly the focus is on the leadership circle, and we have most specifically spent time on the leadership circle profile. And as you know, that there are similarities with the manager edition. The one exception with the manager edition, and it's pertinent this evening, is that the manager edition actually has no systems awareness in it. With the 3 dimensions in the creative of those dimensions, the being dimension, inner circle dimension, consists of self-awareness and authenticity. So the systems awareness piece is actually missing or has been deliberately left out of the manager edition. One of the fundamental premises of the leadership circle is that structure determines performance. And our mind is a structure. Our thinking patterns are a structure. The software that runs those thinking patterns that we call beliefs and assumptions are also a structure and a framework. And the leadership circle as a framework is designed as a structure to help us understand our thinking patterns, our beliefs and assumptions, in order for us to be able to be more effective, both as human beings and as leaders. And as we know, through all the work that we've done, that essentially the key leadership competencies that are measured in the creative half of the circle show up as behaviors and stances and strategies and skills that are associated with leadership effectiveness and enduring business performance. And indeed, the reactive tendencies are enormous strengths. When those strengths are overextended or underutilized, or the competencies are underutilized, we can often trace these to assumptions that might be keeping us small or limiting us in some way, prohibiting our effectiveness in some way. And so in our desire to do this deep dive around the circle, we wanted to spend more time really getting into and looking at the structure that underlies and underpins each one of these dimensions in the leadership circle profile, which, as you know, measures 18 creative competencies and 11 reactive styles or tendencies. And the inner circle consists of 8 inner circle dimensions. Contrast that to the manager edition with 6 inner circle dimensions, 12 outer circle competencies, and 9 reactive tendencies. Both of these are, as many of you would have experienced over the years incredibly powerful, deep, and relevant structures and frameworks to allow people to have conversations that sometimes they've never had before. And my hope for this evening is that in looking through and looking at the systems awareness, that we can actually begin to understand how systems awareness as a competency actually boots up on the structure of adult stages of development, and that we have greater access to systems awareness as our operating system boots into the creative and the integral mind and the meaning making that comes with that. So as you're aware, the Leadership Circle doesn't measure the adult stages of development, but actually points to them, and reliably so. So this evening, we're going to spend some time looking at the operating system, the consciousness that drives effectiveness through the lens of the creative competencies, and most specifically through the lens of systems awareness, which of course measures 3 key leadership competencies in the outer circle. That's the systems thinking, the sustainable productivity, and community concern. And as we have done in the past few series, we have actually unpacked the dimension in response to a whole lot of aspects: mindset, physiology, felt sense. What are the emotions that are associated with this particular dimension? And when we speak, how does that show up in terms of our tone and our volume and timbre, and the particular choice of words that somebody who has is showing up high in systems awareness? What might be some of the language or the choice of words, and how does that actually show up in behavior, in our actions, in our intentions? And we will spend a bit of time looking at what's at risk in the underlying beliefs and assumptions. Marion has a wonderful case study to share with us this evening, and so I would like to hand over to Marion to take us through some of the aspects that we've just covered. So Marion, over to you in relation to having a look at the structure and the mindsets associated with systems awareness.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roma. I think it's really interesting to think about the mindset associated with systems awareness, because it seems to me that the shift in mindset here is really quite essential. And I think that what's really fundamental from my point of view, for those of you who are familiar with Heifetz and Lenski's work, is this shift that shows up as people move further up systems awareness, this shift from a technical to an adaptive mindset. So, and the associated shift from being an expert to a learner. It seems to me that they're the fundamental things, and associated with that, it's been my experience that you see people showing up in terms of their mindset as being much more questioning, a mindset that's really able to accommodate contradictory truths, and a mind that's able to think holistically and think in terms of unintended consequences, non-obvious links. So a real shift in terms of the agility and the flexibility to be dealing with more than one thing at a time, and to be able to think broader and in a more complex way. So I think that's probably all I want to say around mindset. Anything that comes to mind for you, Roma, before we move on?
No, other than as in common with the other creative competencies and the other creative dimensions, that the work of Larry Wilson is that, and that underlying the systems awareness is also this desire for playing to win together. And the perspective is very much, as you said, is around, the capacity for big picture, small picture, medium picture, multiple time horizons, and focused not just within the organization and on the organization, but often beyond the organization as well.
Yes, I think that's right. And the sense of the playing to win together for me really stretches into the deep, deep appreciation that the perspectives that are needed and the way forward is not from the person who might be the leader, but that it really, in order to be able to get some sense of perspective and some sense of way forward, that many players who are affected by whatever is being worked on need to be involved.
Mm-hmm. So, shall we
let's
move
move on
to
then.
physiology? Yeah. Beautiful. Okay.
Rome and I were thinking about this when we were doing our preparation, and it's quite interesting if you think about systems awareness and achieving sitting alongside each other. But I think there's a sort of a different presence really in terms of the body posture around systems awareness. So much more likely to be observant and can even seem detached. So much more likely to be a sense of curiosity and detachment whilst connected. So I think it's not that same sense of energy that you'd often see in high achieving. The energy's there, but it's able to be used with floating attention and able to be used in terms of picking up peripheral dynamics as well. So I think there's much more of a sense in terms of body posture and of somebody watching, observing while staying connected. And the feeling in terms of people noticing the person is really around patience and around people not needing to get immediate closure on things. So that it's not that there isn't energy there, but really the energy is going into understanding rather than moving forward before the understanding's reached. The energy is on the long game and the broader game rather than with a sense of urgency. Anything you want to add to that, Roma?
No, I think that's beautiful. I mean, one of the things that we do have a lot of fun when we're actually doing this together, because it's sort of well, I know when Marion and I were doing it, and I've done it with previous ones, is that it encourages us to stretch into, well, what does that feel like if it's dialed up in us? And and then therein lies some of that. Wow, that's some of the awareness around the gaps. So I was having a wonderful time, learning Marion's perspective around systems awareness, and just the lovely way that her perspective that she brings, that's actually unique and different, with a lovely, as it says, focus is broad and floating. So that peripheral sense of seeing what others don't always see. And so the body posture can allow that, because you can see that the capacity to be able to notice things on the peripheral vision. And yet, as Marion says, still stay very connected. So
I think the thing, if we think about what's often not there, is that sense of anxiety that people often feel in the uncertainty of trying to get a broader picture or trying to take complicated dynamics into account. So that absence of anxiety, and I think that can often be palpable with people who can take that kind of perspective.
Yeah. Which is
Which
a nice
probably
segue kind of into the
yeah,
felt sense. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So picking up what we've just been talking about, I think the felt sense is calm and serene. That sense of patience, waiting for the connections to fall into place, and patient when the connections don't fall into place, and that sense of delight often when the connections do fall into place, and a sense of steadiness about being able to deal with often the pulls between internal needs and external needs, or short-term needs and long-term needs. So this sense of feeling connected without being swept along with things, feeling trust in things unfolding and trust in the bigger picture unfolding. So I think the internal sense often is light and curious, and can often be one of being delighted, and also a sense, if we think about the community concern side of things, and also in relation to sustainable productivity, a sense of responsibility as well.
Yes.
So I think often people don't need to feel that connection to responsibility when they have a narrow perspective on things, but as people are higher up the systems awareness, you can feel that broader sense of responsibility. Anything you want to add there, Roma?
No, I think not. Maybe, I mean, I'm wondering if we have any questions, or we want to just invite anybody in to share any of their own perspectives on this. Is there
that'd be
anybody
fantastic.
Yeah. For those of you that joined after we talked about the protocols, if you would like to, there's two ways: is putting up your hand in the panel, or in fact writing one of the questions in the question panel. But it looks like at the moment that we can continue flowing, and we'll invite you, if you would like to at some stage, to put up your hand or ask a question. Please feel free. So what we will do is let's continue, and we'll continue into having a look at the emotions.
I think we've mentioned some of these, but it's the thing that strikes me is really the sense of the emotions being around curiosity and openness, patience, a sense of mischief, a sense of wonder around things, a sense of lightness, a sense of responsibility that we mentioned earlier, but also the sense of feeling more secure in uncertainty. So I think because the more people are, the higher people rate in terms of system awareness, the greater awareness they have really about the environment in which we live, the volatility, the uncertainty, and the greater sense of awareness they have of how many things they can't know. So it really brings on that sense of people being able to stand in adaptive challenges, and therefore what's going with that is that sense of being less anxious about being uncertain, and also that sense, that real sense in terms of emotions of feeling connected to others, so that whatever it is that's needing to be progressed can be progressed, and whatever it's needing to be thought about can be thought about. So I think that the main things are probably would want to touch on in terms of emotions.
As you were describing that, one leader, actually two leaders that I have worked with came to mind, and both of them had an uncanny ability around, people would call them intuitive in a way, because of this, that their awareness around what was going on in the system, in groups, but outside the groups and across the organizations. And one of the things that I noticed is that people were attracted to them because of their sense of calm. um, and that it wasn't that they didn't experience any kind of turmoil or anxiety or fear or concern at any time, but their sense of calm and their ability to be able to detach from when people were getting overly emotional or overly heated. So that, here this is that we're talking about emotions and the curiosity and the openness to vulnerability, and that certainly was true. And there was this deep sense of calm, particularly when things were quite chaotic.
Mm.
And people find that quite attractive, because it's the ability to detach from the charge of emotions that can actually then lead to reactivity and stay connected at the same time, which is, that paradoxical, how do we detach and stay connected at the same time?
And the thing, I'm listening to you, and I was thinking about this earlier on today, how, of course, systems awareness is not appearing in isolation. And we're looking at the rest of a profile. But it seems to me that someone can bring strengths in systems awareness towards objective thinking. So they're more in the task orientation, or someone can bring strengths in systems awareness more towards the relationship side of things. So the concern around thinking about the system and thinking about the longer term and thinking about the broader environment might manifest itself in terms of emotions of, if we think about relationship-based emotions, love of these things, or alternatively, somebody might be far more objective. So I do think the emotional tone can be different depending on what else is showing up in the profile and where else somebody has their center of gravity.
And yeah, and we have actually David Bennett, who's on the webinar with us tonight. David has actually written a question, and I'd like to actually share it with all of you. David says that a lot of descriptions of systems awareness remind me of embodied mindfulness, something that I'm familiar with from Buddhist teachings, for example, Pema Chodron's writings, and being comfortable with uncertainty. And being new to TLC, is this a relevant comparison to make? That embodied mindfulness and something that I'm from, that being comfortable with uncertainty. And I think that, one of the things that Pema Chodron does write a lot about, as do many of the other Buddhist teachers, is about this sense of groundlessness, that sense of being mindful and able to navigate the uncertainty and the complexity and the volatility, and in a sense, is systems awareness in and of itself a metaphor for mindfulness? I don't know. It's a good question. What do you think, Marion?
Again, I think it depends on what else is showing up with it. So I think if we took it in isolation, that would be so. But I think it will depend on what kind of reactivity is showing up with it, number one, and number two, what companion pieces are showing up with it in terms of the creative side of things.
Yeah.
So it's been my experience that where systems awareness is showing up and the person's very strongly task oriented, so they're showing up as well in achieving, but maybe lower in relating, because of course they do show up that way, that I think that if someone doesn't have self-awareness, that they can often be, despite the fact that they can think from a systems awareness perspective, it can often be an intellectual approach to things. I think it's some of the other traits that show up that stop the person being a mind, just a mind, or just an intellect. And I think if someone's just a mind or just an intellect, that that they're not showing up strongly in terms of that embodied mindfulness that you're talking about. So I think
it depends.
It depends. Yeah.
What else is going on in the profile?
Yeah.
But great question. Thanks, David.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Shall we move on to
Yeah, voice.
Tonality, voice and
Mm.
tonality.
Mm. So I think, again, when we were thinking about this, we were thinking about it in comparison to, for example, achieving. And here, the tone is much more likely to be variable. So the tone is one of waiting, being including people, more likely to be um, hesitant in the best sense of hesitant in terms of involving, yet and so has and connecting ideas, connecting people. So the voice is not necessarily fast, energetic. It's more that the voice holding the connection and holding the exploration and holding the curiosity. But because remember, it's fitting in the task quartile, so it can still be an authoritative voice. Um, and use its authority to hold open space and to hold open more complexity than often people want to deal with because of the anxiety that gets raised through looking at complexity. Um, so likely to be purposeful and yet in all holding ground and holding openness and holding space.
And Grace Thomas has written something that she's saying that people that I see with high systems awareness mostly don't take themselves too seriously, and they can juggle work, fun, relationships beautifully. And this often shows up in their voice and their tone and their behaviors, and just a bit of a bit of joyfulness can come through when when other things are also happening in the circle, when you've got more of, as you're saying, the companion competencies that are happening.
And I think that's a really nice point. I was going to raise that point later, because I think if someone's high on systems awareness, they're less likely to be somebody who's just work focused, because it is it's a being thing, really. So they're likely to have interests in lots of things outside of work. So I don't know about other people, but I work with people who, because of the hours they work, because of the intensity of their work, because of who they are really sort of life support systems for some kind of working machine. But it's likely that someone who's scoring higher in terms of systems awareness has a broad range of interests, that the systems awareness doesn't just get turned on in their work context. Reading more broadly, interested in all sorts of weird and wonderful things, where they continue to make these kind of connections in their lives.
Mm.
So, for example, one of my one of the participants, in fact, who's in the case study, it wasn't just bringing his systems awareness into his work scenario. He was doing very significant work in the community as well, and
Yeah.
bringing that way of thinking into the community. But they're often really interesting people, because they've got that lovely breath to them in terms of the way they look at things. So often
Yeah.
lovely company because of that.
And sometimes, I've done a lot of work in the, in the IT space, and there are a number of people who particularly work in sort of the architecture area of IT, who I find to be incredibly humorous and quite quirky in many ways,
Mm. Mm.
um, and have an enormous systems awareness. And when that is combined with achieving or purposeful and visionary and authenticity and a definite sense of self-awareness and relating, um, it can be quite a fresh, different, unusual perspective that they can bring to the organization.
Yes,
Um,
and on the other hand, where it's present without some of the relating side of things and self-awareness side of things, they often end up um, not blending in well in organizations, I think.
Absolutely, yeah, and disengaging in terms of stakeholder engagement is that,
Mm.
that seems to be a big, big challenge that I've
Mm.
noticed. Yeah, wow,
Mm.
yeah. Beautiful.
It's
Okay.
what just one other thing with that. Following on from that question, uh, I was wondering as I was as following on from you and I having had this conversation and in preparation for tonight, I'm wondering really how effective a leader can be in senior roles with adaptive challenges unless they rate well in terms of systems awareness. So
Mm,
a lot of my work and a lot of the work that I think that I will continue to do is really based on helping people to develop their systems awareness. I think even if people are, rating well in terms of achieving or relating, if they are in complex, difficult roles, which of course people are once they get
mm,
into senior roles, that they really do need this level of awareness in order to be able to lead their organizations effectively.
mm. Beautifully said. And beautiful question that you asked, which is actually, if we move to the next slide, is around the language and the words, and that the use of the deliberate use and the intentional use of words to invoke a greater sense of um, peripheral awareness.
Yes, and so I think some of the words here, you'll see the words, some of the kind of phrases are that you'll see that the thrust really is about getting multiple perspectives, about really encouraging people to think what they can't bear to think, or to bring into the room what's not been brought into the room, or to bring in perspectives other than the perspectives that people have. So really pushing, as you said, Roma, for something outside of the ordinary way of looking at things. Um, really encouraging questions and encouraging thinking. So it seems to me that if we think about the growth and development for somebody as they move through systems awareness, it's really from being very good at the answers in the lower reaches of systems awareness to being very good at questions in the high, when they're up at 80 or 90%, that they really can ask those questions that blow open the current perspective and way of thinking, and that they can hold people to think differently. And so what we've done there is put in some of those questions, and they're the kind of questions that those of you who might have worked with Jennifer Garvey-Berger would see the kinds of questions that Jennifer would be thinking about in terms of thinking, having people work in complex systems.
And often asking the questions that others don't ask
Yes.
is what I have noticed. And I notice you do that incredibly well, Marion. And it's actually asking the questions about what isn't as much as what is.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where these things that we've talked about earlier, the patience, the lightness, the sense of humor, the curiosity, the quirkiness, all help, I think, to be oriented in that type of way. And it seems to me that one of the greatest defenses against high systems awareness is knowing.
Yes.
And so, we'll come later to thinking about some of the things that discourage people or aren't helpful for people in terms of systems awareness. But I think that arrogance is certainly one of those things that,
Mm-hmm.
that this force that has somebody love having the answers rather than love having the questions.
Mm-hmm. Which
So
is
that's,
actually is in a sense is that what are we asking the questions for? And that
yes.
it's in a sense it's that the intentionality behind that.
And who are we asking?
And
Yes, you're dead right. And who are we asking the questions of?
yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's right.
and that ability to make up words like unknowingness, ability to stand in complexity and
See, you see
unknowingness.
see, if you're making up words, that's a privilege that Irish people have.
Yeah. Well, it must be my half Irish that gets that finds that really appealing, huh?
Mm.
Uh, but this is where the behaviors really do line up with intentions when there's an orientation to connecting to something larger, something in a greater and larger sense of direction.
And this was the place when Roma and I were preparing for this. This is the place where I think I said, but let's not imagine here that we're dealing, if we're coming back to some of what we've talked earlier about mindfulness as well, let's not imagine here that we're dealing with the Dalai Lama. I think the behaviors, um, of course, they're about including multiple perspectives and being oriented towards that. But the thing that I probably would like to emphasize here is that my experience of people who do this well are also very much willing to engage with politics and willing to engage with power and willing to engage with conflict. So
Yep.
we're not just dealing with a mellow soul here. We're really dealing with somebody here who's, sorry, that's just, sorry, I've got a phone ringing there that I can't disconnect. It'll go away in a minute. Um, we're dealing here with people's willingness to deal with factions and to recognize that they're working in a power system. And so their systems awareness is very much about organizational savviness and also about being willing to get, in terms of thinking about sustainable productivity and community concern, also able to build allies and to be able to really work their systems awareness towards making progress. So they're not, I think that people who are high in systems awareness, again, if we come back to thinking, it's placed here in the task quartile. So we're dealing with people who are interested in making progress and willing to take on conflict and use their power in order to make progress, having thought about things more broadly. So it just seems important to emphasize that there is this, I think, willingness and desire to make progress.
And rock the boat at times is my
Yes,
experience.
yeah.
Yeah.
Turn up the heat, take the heat, turn up the heat, willing to call things that people don't see when they're just coming from their own faction, willing to call things that people don't see because they're in work avoidance and in anxiety. So really able to not just I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's not just thinking and observing, it is
Hmm.
actually thinking with a view to making progress. So it
For
feels
the
like it's
sake of
got,
something bigger.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's got an action orientation.
And it's not always rosy. I mean, it's and that which brings us to the next piece, which is, what is it? What's at risk? How can we get in our own way? What are some of the Achilles heels, or what are the bungee cords that can actually yank us out of, systems awareness as a structure and as a way of thinking and as a way of showing up?
Yeah, and perhaps even before we think about what can get in our own way and what's at risk, when we think about that, of course, we think about internal world. But if we think about that just for a moment, based on last slide, and think about it from external world, I think that where people with have elements of systems awareness, but don't play their organizational savviness well,
Uh-huh.
that people are at risk of getting knocked off because
Yes.
often they'll be the activists. So they'll be the ones that see the issues, the concerns, the broader picture that others are either unable to or unwilling to see.
Mm.
And without the interpersonal skills and without the composure and without their systems awareness also being about the political system in their organization or in whatever arena they're involved in, they are vulnerable to being knocked off.
Mm.
So I think that there's not just external, internal risks, which will come to, but those external risks as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh.
And
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 actually,
and and a sense of because there is the and I go back to the ones that I think of, and the ones who the people that I've worked with large systems awareness, and some of them with relating and self-awareness, and others not, and a
mm,
sense of what is at risk is being ostracized.
for sure. And it's funny as I kind of, as I and we do the work that we do um, in progressing this, it's sort of a bit of a broken record with the groups that we work with. I say number one is staying alive. That you well, often when people are high in any of these areas, they are presenting a mirror to their organization that people just don't want to see. And
Mm.
so this is not a place for you're not wanting encouraging people to be crazy brave. You're wanting to encourage people to have this thinking and to be able to work in their system.
Mm.
I'm wondering, Roma, because we're kind of going back into internal world again and thinking about what's at risk, maybe this might be another moment where we might think about whether people have any other questions.
Yes, it's a great point. And also bearing in mind that everything that we're discussing and what we're listing here on each one of these slides is not intended to stereotype, but to give generic examples and to provoke some other thinking around how systems awareness shows up in leaders and indeed in ourselves. Um, are there any questions? And again, I'm looking at the hand just to see if anybody's got any questions. I'm looking at the question panel. It seems not at this moment,
There
Marion.
is Roma. Yeah, David did pass on a question. Marion, I've forwarded this to you. You should be able to pick that up. Can you
We've
see the
we've
question?
we've covered off David and Grace.
David sent a second question.
Oh, he did. I haven't seen that.
No,
Okay.
because I sent it to Marion. So, shall I send it to Roma, Marion?
Yes, because I can't actually see it, Adele.
Actually, if
Okay.
you
So
could
I've
read it
got
out, Adele.
got your
Adele,
note
why
beside
don't you
me.
read it?
Sure. So, David asks, when you ask how can a leader perform if they don't rate well in systems awareness, as a coach, I have the same thought about leadership or executive coaches. Do they need to rate well in this competency?
Oh, this is such a magic question, isn't it?
Yes.
Magic question. Yeah.
Um, and it really, this for me is a fundamental question around coaches in relation to it, because it seems to me that very often that we as a community, that a community of coaches, don't particularly come with that point of view. That we often have models of thinking that are based on the person's internal world, so the intrapersonal. That we have models of looking at things that are based on the interpersonal. That we might look at a even go as far as thinking about team effectiveness, but that often that we don't think systemically. And my own view is that very often what's happening for a person, for an individual, that if all we do is interpret what's happening from a personal perspective rather than from a systemic perspective, that we are not sometimes helping the person as well as we might as coaches. So I think it's a really pertinent question about where our own competence needs to lie and our own capacities to be able to think in this way. Yeah, I mean, some people who are on the call have heard me say this before. I just don't think that we can take our clients to places that we can't go ourselves, certainly not emotionally. But I think in this particular space, if we're not able to formulate thinking and formulate questions and model the kind of behavior, that it's very difficult to support a client's development in that regard.
And
I'm
that
sure. I'm
brings me,
sure he would. I'm sure he'd have his own perspective. I mean, it sounded like a rhetorical question, really, didn't it?
yeah. And I'm wondering if You know, when in terms of systems awareness, the word role is often used, you know, and what role are we taking up? And that I think that that's relevant to us as both coaches and consultants. You know, are we taking up a role, and as part of that role, embodying the greater perspectives, the multiple perspectives, the larger peripheral vision, our ability to be able to make ourselves vulnerable and to help our clients connect dots and to show up in the political milieu that often exists in organizations. And, you know, in terms of what's at risk for leaders in organizations, I mean, in fact, is their role one that either enhances and enables them and encourages them to grow the systems awareness competencies, or have they got a role that actually limits that in a way? And what's their responsibility in there? What's their, you know, so again, we've got the outer and the inner game tension happening. But another great edgy question, as you said, Marion, from David. Thank you, David. Shall we move?
Maybe if we turn our mind to what can get in people's ways, you know, kind of what's at risk in terms of someone being able to retain or maintain a stance in terms of systems awareness.
Do you want me to go back to the previous slide, or are you happy with this one?
So, so let's look at the internal assumptions. Do you want to talk to that?
Sure. You know, and again, if you, in the self-development guide, that's pointing you to a resource that is come in incredibly handy for a number of us, and that is on page 41 of the resource guide. There are some mentions of, you know, what are some of the beliefs and assumptions that are embodied or that are grown up and focused on when somebody is actually high in systems awareness, and that sense of, you know, that in high critical, when critical is running really high and dialed up in an individual, they can often see what is seen by somebody who's high in systems awareness, so can see what others don't see. And the difference between the high critical or the high protecting and the high systems awareness is that I criticize the system of which I am part. In systems awareness, that I actually see that I am an integral part of that whole, and so I have responsibility and accountability, and therefore my actions can reflect the culture. And I am conscious of, Marion mentioned this before, of consequences, both intended and negative unintended consequences, in different time space. You know, the cause and effect, and often far removed in both space and time, but having the capacity to be able to connect those dots. And, you know, I have that belief and assumption that there is cause and effect, and often separated by space and time, and often realizing that, you know, last week we were talking about systems are living organisms, organizations are living organisms, are living systems with mechanical parts. And much of what goes on, and the belief and assumption, is that it is invisible, it is intangible. There's an energetic field in relation to organizations, and that my legacy is not about being remembered. I'm not doing this. I don't come from a systems perspective as a high systems thinker, but about contributing to the welfare of others, which is often greater than just the organization, as you heard Marion talking before. Marion? You want to jump in and add other thoughts and perspectives around internal assumptions that grow up and that show up with systems awareness?
I don't think I want to really emphasize anything other than what I've said before, that the internal assumption is that I can't possibly know the whole, and maybe the whole isn't even knowable, that all I can do is, nudge towards some kind of understanding of things, so that things are really emergent and that things are complex, and that my thinking therefore has got to be thinking that matches that sense of emergence and that sense of complexity. So that my assumptions are that I'll do a good analysis, I'll get on top of things, and then we'll start a pilot program and roll it out. That those kind of that way of working, I think the assumption is that way of working is not going to really work in complex systems, to which you would really be applying this kind of thinking. That's the kind of thinking that belongs to more complicated systems. So I think the internal assumptions are that the ways of acting and the ways of thinking are not the ways of acting and thinking that were appropriate for complicated systems.
And of course, that's a beautiful segue into the next piece, which leads us into the case study, which is, when we are working with leaders in organizations who have a lower sense of, or their competencies in systems awareness are lower, where do we show up? How do we show up with them? Which is part of what David was asking before. How do we best show up to support them? What will this require of us? And for us to be able to get curious about our own relationship. Oh, that's got empowered relating there, actually. Look at that. It's actually empowered systems awareness, so that we can indeed begin to lean into it ourselves. And so when thinking about and going deep diving around the circle this whole year, we did consciously think about who we could engage with from the TLC Asia Pacific community to share their experiences around these different dimensions of the circle. And Marion we were having dinner one night, and I went, would you be willing to do the systems awareness? Because she's just doing some incredible work in organizations, and so she's very kindly offered to share with us tonight a particular case study of an organization and a group of people that she's been working with. And so, Mariam, I'll ask you to guide me as to when you're ready for me to move on to the next slide. I don't know if you want to set any context before we do.
Great, yeah, I would. I'd like to set a little bit of context first. So I'll try and keep this brief so that people can then come in and ask, that we do leave time for questions and comments. So the context is that we're going to talk about a group of 7, and this group is part of a broader group, a group of 22 undertaking an executive development program, a 10-month executive development program that is highly experiential in nature. It's a program that I designed. It's got 5 modules, and over the 10 months, and in between each of the modules, there's individual coaching, and there's peer group coaching, and there's commercial learning projects. So the thrust of the work is that in module 1, they look at their internal world and they get a leadership circle profile, and they commence their peer coaching. In module 2, they get an experiential introduction to adaptive leadership, to Hafiz and Linsky's work, In Module 3, they learn about dealing with complexity and business-driven action learning, and they commence work on projects, which they then work on throughout Modules 4 through to 5, and they do integration work in Module 4. So that's the general architecture of the program. And the objectives of the program, that we're working with them to help them get increased complexity of mind, to move from reactive into creative in most instances. So certainly helping people to become self-authoring and creative, and wanting to increase their ability to deal with complex adaptive systems. I mean, there are organizational objectives, but really underlying it are these things. So this group, their learning project, their commercial learning project, it was about helping the organization to become more customer-centric. The group self-selected based on the topic, based on having some diversity in the group, multiple aspects of diversity. And of course, there was a maximum group size. Given that there was a group of 22, the group size needed to be no more than 7 or 8. So that's really the context. So I'm happy now, Romeo, if you want to move on to the next slide.
Absolutely.
I'll talk about where we started.
All right. So one by one, as you can see, I am bringing up the leadership circle profiles of the 7 individuals that were in this particular cohort.
Okay, so this is the cohort that I worked with, and the other 2 cohorts were worked with by other consultants. So each of the 3 project groups had a consultant who was working as a coach to that group. However, we had mixed up the individual coaching. So of this 7, I was the group coach and I was the individual coach for some of these people, but other people were the individual coaches for some others. So there was kind of a diversity across the coaching. That's probably important to raise before we start. So the starting point, look, I really came to absolutely delight and care very deeply about this group of people. Their starting point was that they, in terms of learning style, mainly activists, a few pragmatists in terms of learning style, not an iota of reflecting happening, and very low in terms of being theorists as well. So they were action-oriented, they were high energy, mainly strongly extroverted, and they had in the group, it developed over time, there was a fantastic sense of humor in the group, but this enthusiastic, energetic, action-oriented. So that's fantastic as a start. What it meant, of course, is that they, and you'll see it as you can look at some of their systems awareness in terms of their profiles, largely they found it very difficult to reflect. So they were impatient to do things quickly, and they found it, they kind of just wanted to dive right in terms of action. So the dynamic in the group, to start with, you'll see the 2 profiles in the middle where people had stronger systems awareness. But the dynamic, just given the nature of the group, was that those that were in charge of the fire ready aim, think shallow, move fast, those were the people who were really kind of leading the group at the beginning. Another thing I probably need to mention as part of that energetic dynamic is that only leader D was female, all of the others were male. So we were in, the starting point was they were in single loop learning mode. They were going from data to action. Their early analysis of the issue was entirely technical, very based on old style problem solving, looking at all the old familiar places for change as they were thinking about how they might move the organization towards being more customer centric, and very rambling style. So it wasn't all bad news. there were some really good things as they started, because they already met each other on 2 prior modules. There was a good level of trust as a starting point, and they'd already done some sharing of the leadership circle profile experiences. All of them had had the feedback, so there was at least awareness, if not complete change, around some of the arrogance and distance that you can see in the profiles. So that's kind of the starting point. I think I might just talk about some of the things that we did at the beginning that were important, and then I'll talk about what happened over time. So I think some of the things that we did that were really useful at the beginning is that we required them to develop a purpose early in their time together as a group, something that they wouldn't have done in terms of their own inclination. They wouldn't have done it at all. So that discipline of making them sit back and think about what do they want to achieve as a group proved to be really, really helpful for them. It also, there was a requirement that they share their profiles, so that they could talk honestly with each other about their reactivity, about the development needs, and about their strengths. And that was a really very, very deep, rigorous sharing. So they got off to a good start in terms of honesty around that. So I think those 2 requirements, program requirements, and there are certainly requirements that I held them to in the work, where it was really important. But what was also really important from my perspective in terms of coaching them is that I intervened pretty strongly in the beginning. I mean, they were robust, they were running ahead, and some of my early interventions went down like a lead balloon. So when I talked to them about the fact that they weren't taking up roles effectively, that they were in single loop learning, they were going from data to action in that single loop learning mode, and they weren't thinking from I'm putting all of this in the negative. I didn't necessarily with them, but they were thinking from a technical perspective, on an adaptive perspective, and that they were action oriented, but they were not purposeful. They really reacted very defensively to some of my early coaching interventions. So it was a pretty rough ride with them in the beginning. Their arrogance got into play, as you'll see with some of the profiles, and their distance got into play. And it's interesting, you'll see the 2 profiles in the middle of the people who had the strongest systems awareness. But there were a couple of things in terms of their own reactivity that showed up that made it difficult for those people to show up in the group initially. So the leader D, the woman that I talked about, as you can see, virtually no reactivity, but overly modest. So she was really underconfident in terms of putting herself out there. And leader F takes a long time to warm up. So they weren't showing up strongly in terms of cutting, which they could have, cutting against this thrust in the beginning. Anyway, we overcame all of that, which was fantastic. And the kind of things that happened over time were that they started to use, after our rough ride, they started to use roles effectively. So they started to use the strength of leader F, who had very strong process skills in terms of running meetings. They used his strengths really effectively, and they used leader D's, because she was you can see how creative she is, modest, helpful. They started using her strengths in terms of synthesizing things really effectively. They started to use time boundaries far better. And the magic thing that happened with them is that they learned, and this took a lot of coaching work on my behalf, they learned to slow down their thinking. So what in the beginning would have been intolerable for them in terms of staying with questions, broadening their perspectives, working in a spacious way, became second nature to them, and they began to love it by the time they'd worked together, which was over a period of 4 months. So they learned over time to be able to think from an adaptive perspective. So they learned how to hypothesize about what might be going on. They learned to think about the different perspectives from different factions. They learned to think about where they might have been encountering work avoidance, or they might have been showing it themselves. So there was a real practical bent to what this systems thinking meant for them. So they started to become much more outside in their perspective, much thinking about things from a much more complex point of view. And interesting, I think, from a community concern perspective, they really began truly and deeply to think from the point of view of the customer. So they really moved in their thinking to say, what if we were shaping our organization? What if we were shaping our worlds from the point of view of the customer? So what I really learned personally in the process is that systems awareness, when it's happening and growing and developing, is not a head thing, it's a heart thing, and it's a guts thing as well. That the heart component of it is that if you've got really good systems awareness, you've also got meaningful connection to people and individuals that are affected, and you've got courage to do something. So I really learned a lot from in that process. So they became far better at affecting change in a complex system, at trying safe to fail experiments, at trying things and at failing, at nudging the system rather than going to the knot in the system and trying to go after the tough stuff. They became considerably better at asking questions. They became considerably better at seeing unintended consequences. And they became really elegant in terms of reviewing their progress and having honest feedback. And so they called out Leader D in terms of her magic, her fantastic underutilized skills. They called out Leader F in terms of him not showing up, and got him to show up much more. And then they called out some of the really tough stuff. So Leader E, as you can see, had very strong arrogance. And Leader E, they lovingly cut him down to size. And that was fantastic in him learning to step back and to be able to think far more effectively in terms of systems thinking. So he, because he wasn't rushing and cocksure he knew everything, became far better able to contribute to things. So the rule for him in the group was that he was to talk 50% less and make it 50% more meaningful. And that enabled a whole lot more thinking to happen rather than him closing on discussions earlier. Some of the other things that happened is that I really was delighted with their move into being able to use double and triple loop learning, and they pushed for cross-boundary groups. So they gave up a team member, they gave up Leader C because another group lost members. So they became far more selfless as they thought about what are the needs of the broader system, not just our little group here. And I just want to see, is there anything else? I can come back and talk more about the individuals later if we want, but I'm mindful of time and leaving room for people. So I just want to talk through for a moment what they said they learned through the process. So I'm reading from one of their slides in terms of their final presentation. They said that we learned that we're hardwired to go for process and policy, so for technical stuff, and it's far more effective to start with enduring purpose. So that sense of being able to think far more broadly and far more long-term and far more purposefully. They learned that emotion eats logic for breakfast, that if you're going to do something from a systems perspective, that you need to create an emotional connection within that system, that living systems are about emotional connections, not just about dry technical things. They learned that a series of small steps can shift the system, and that we've got a lot more influence than we thought. They learned that there was value in safe to fail experiments, and they learned as much from failure as they did from successes. And they learned that in terms of strengthening the system and getting change in the system, that they could amplify existing strengths to get there. And interestingly, given where you'll see in terms of their protecting, they learned to value vulnerability, that it fast tracks trust and progress. So they really shifted in regards to that. And they learned that being system aware isn't about complicating things. So they're trying to get away from complicating things. So they're probably, I mean, I could go with some of the other things. They're probably the main things I want to talk about in terms of their learning. So some of the things from our point of view that we did that helped, and that I did that helped in terms of coaching them, and the one-on-one coaches worked. So we worked beautifully across the coaching team. So I could say this is happening in the group, and it could be dealt with one-on-one, and they could be the feedback from one-on-one into what could be happening in the group. So we were working systemically ourselves as coaches to shift them and shift the entire group to a systems way of thinking and shift their development. So we held them in their learning. So it was really difficult for them. So repeatedly turning up the heat on them so that they could extend their thinking and learn how to think rather than just act. We supported them, we challenged them, and weren't afraid actually when they were stumped about not knowing how to think, to model that thinking for them. So I mentioned the strong early intervention, but we also held them in terms of regular reviews. We had conducted a feedback session with them that was fantastic. So we did a call out, watch out session. So each of them got really deep feedback about how they were shifting and how they might further shift and how they had developed as we did the work together. So apart from the regular how are we traveling reviews, they also got individual feedback based on their progress as they worked together. And we worked, as individual coaches and I worked with their strengths. So they had humor and they had energy, and that had to be taken into account as they were learning how to reflect and how to conceptualize. So certainly worked with that strength, and also gave them lots of feedback that they were getting warmer, and in addition to that, once they started maturing, I also got out of the way. So there were lots of meetings where they didn't need me getting involved. And we honored the struggle for them, and it was a really tough struggle for them in the beginning. So that's probably as much as I'd say for now, and I'm happy to answer questions or talk more about individual shifts during that time. And of course, I mean, if we're thinking about systems awareness, they weren't just shifting in one dimension, they were shifting in lots of ways, but I've just been picking about what was happening predominantly in the systems awareness dimension. The rest of the world was moving with them at the time. So
Beautiful.
maybe, and this is the group, this is the starting group profile.
Yeah. And Marion, we actually have had a couple of questions, and one of them actually has come from Rod Griffiths, which is another one of Rod's edgy questions. He says, so do systems exist, or is systems awareness a way of thinking about and engaging with things at a deeper level?
Look, I always come back in relation to this, to the work that's old now, Gareth Morgan's work. I mean, it's I guess late 80s now, isn't it? Metaphors for thinking about organizations. I think we have to. My perspective on things is that thinking about organizations as living systems is a metaphor, that we can't take it literally, but that if we think that we've come from a metaphor of thinking about organizations as machines, and that we might, as we mature through things over the next years, find a better metaphor. But I think from my perspective, I don't forget that thinking about organizations as living systems is thinking metaphorically.
And I'm wondering, and Rod, keen to talk with you about this as well, and if you'd like to us to open up the conversation with you, is that are you about systems, the systems we tend to talk about are the systems where there are people involved in the systems. So are we talking about other kinds of systems as well? And does that systems awareness competencies, do those competencies allow an appreciation of systems other than systems that are actually made up of human beings. And I don't know the answer to that. I suspect we could be here for a long time if we get. But Rod, if you'd like to, would you like us to open up and for you to have a more of a conversation with us on that? Adele, could you see if Rod's willing
Sure.
to, does he want to talk?
Yeah.
We do have another question also after this. So, Rod, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Rod.
Oh,
How are you
okay,
doing?
right. Yes, okay. I see my microphone's on now.
Hi, Rob.
Yeah.
Magic.
Rod, I'd like to. Do you know Marion?
No,
No, I don't. No. But I'm sort of struck. I'm just getting used to having headphones on and talking through the microphone. That some people seem to live in a world where their system is a reality, and I see this in the IT world particularly. And so they think that what we need to do is engineer the system and everything will fall into place. Whereas others are literally thinking in system terms and feeling their way through systems, which is a completely different phenomenon. And through this discussion, I felt that we're in the feeling aspects of systems, which seems a real oddity because that's not where you'd first go in talking about systems.
The paradox of systems, huh?
Mm.
but it does strike. I mean, I guess it depends. And if you're in the IT world, there's, I guess, you start to think. It depends on what's, as Roma said, what system you're talking about. If you're talking about the engineering components of the IT world, to some degree, that's very different to the world in which people who work in IT work. When I've worked in that world, people are really clear that they can't engineer that world. The world of their interactions with the business, the world of their interactions with other components, whether it's architects, developers. So maybe we've worked with different experiences. I feel that what people are doing by way of architecture development, they might think of in that way, but certainly it's been my experience of them that they don't think that way around the living system.
Mm. Mm.
And I think, but your point to my mind is really important, that part of what we're doing when we're helping people move towards systems awareness is helping people to become aware of the metaphor that is still rampant in organizational life, that organizations are machines, that we can change structures, we can do this and that and the other, and somehow or other it's not going to affect other things. And helping them again think metaphorically about, well, what does this mean if we think about this as a living system? But I think you're dead right. It's very dangerous if we start thinking that's thinking literally in that regard.
I encourage people to think about, this is an ecological point, the corporate ecology that they're part of.
Yes.
So how does what we do affect what's immediately around us and help bring that to a productive and healthy balance?
Yes. And as long as we remember that too is a metaphor. It just seems
that's a metaphor as well. Absolutely.
It just seems the most useful one we have right now. But I think it helps us to hold it lightly and realize it is but a metaphor.
So that I think we shift then from systems thinking to being systemic.
And remembering that it is often a journey, where people are that it's like, okay, now I have a definition for systems, and now I have another definition for systems, and so it's actually being in the experiment and being in often the messy zigzag journey that it takes to and then going, well, maybe there's something more here.
Absolutely. You know, 'cause the first take on systems is, you know, air conditioning systems and all that technical stuff like that. But this conversation has gone to a completely different arena.
And it is, and if I can make a segue into the arena where and because I think that we've got some other questions around. And Rod, it's beautiful to have your voice in this because I know that you've done a lot of work in this space. So very much appreciate you sharing, and maybe next year what we can open up some questions around, you know, and have some webinars where we can share some more wisdom around this.
Yeah,
So
we're onto
thank you.
something with all this, quite frankly.
I think you're right. Thanks, Rod. Appreciate it. Okay. Which is partly where I was segueing to before. And Marion, are you okay if we start meandering towards the end here?
Absolutely.
Great. So some of you may be saying, well, what are some of the coaching strategies apart from what you heard Marion talking about, which was some of the longer term, non-episodic, non-event type, so that it was a deliberately designed journey to continue to allow those 7 individuals in the cohort and indeed the system around them to start getting the benefit of the shifts. So what are some of the ways that we can actually work with people from a coaching perspective, bearing in mind that there are the opposites of each of the dimensions in the circle, and they're also what we have the near enemies. And if we look at it from the opposites perspective, you know, that we have the opposite of authenticity and self-awareness and systems awareness often tends to be protecting, but it can also be some of the complying aspects and some of the controlling aspects on the opposite side. And indeed, when it starts to grow, we can actually see it manifest in terms of the creative orientation in some of those areas. And we know that from a correlations perspective, that the protecting and systems awareness has a negative correlation, and it's a fairly strong negative correlation. It's minus 0.53, meaning that the higher that a leader shows up in protecting, the chances are that that there will be some breaks on their ability to be able to grow into the creative orientation and systems awareness. And at the same time, there are some enormous gifts. You can see the scatter diagram, that it is quite scattered, meaning that there are some gifts in there, that the protecting does indeed assist with some of that systems awareness, particularly in relation to seeing things that others don't see.
Can I just say a little bit about that in practice, Roma?
Yeah.
In practice, it's been my experience that shows up in particular, that, you know, the higher people are in protecting, the more difficult it is for them to allow themselves to feel incompetent. And to my mind, that a prerequisite for people developing in terms of systems awareness is the ability to nudge towards allowing themselves to feel more incompetent. Because that you've got to be able to sit with not knowing and sit with asking questions in that space. So, you know, in practice, we can see how true this correlation is.
And then the segue into protecting and leadership effectiveness. Again, you know, that there are enormous gifts and strengths in the protecting area. And when it's when it's not baked up and over dialed, that can allow for leadership effectiveness to come through. When it is dialed up, then the leadership effectiveness starts to, in other people's eyes, indeed, is to, you know, they start to question the leadership effectiveness at times. So again, it's a bit of a paradox. can support leadership effectiveness, but it's still a negative correlation, and it's almost quite high. And then, of course, when we look at systems awareness, when the systems awareness piece without protecting, we can see that it actually goes to a very positive correlation, meaning that the more people show up with systems awareness, the more likely others are to see them with leadership effectiveness. And the correlation would be that their protecting is not as high any longer, or some of the other reactives are not as high. And so one of the coaching strategies for this is to help leaders go, and you can look at the questions. What is systems awareness actually measuring? And so one of the ways to help people grow some perspective is to look at, like, systems thinker. There are 3 questions in relation to systems thinker. When you look at sustainable productivity, there are 3 questions there. And this begins the process for many of them in relation to becoming more aware. Oh, that's what it's about. Oh, I hadn't thought about it like that before. And therein lies the opportunity and the gateway for them to start to enter into not only the external journey of how do I show up, what do I need to learn, what are some of the skills or the competencies that I need to grow, but also the internal journey that can come with that as well. That's one way of looking at the coaching, apart from putting them, and I love what you did with this group, Marion. You actually put them into a system for them to learn about systems awareness.
Look, I just think, if you, just sorry, I could have crossed you very briefly, Roma. I think that it's very difficult for someone to learn about systems awareness, particularly if you take a group like I had with activists, pragmatists, very difficult for them to learn without having experience to learn off. I don't think people can learn conceptually in this space. I mean, there's a heap of conceptual stuff there, but it's not the same as people struggling with a real issue.
In a real system, in a real life, in a team, which is a system, in a cohort, and in a group, and in an organization.
Yes,
that serves
all of that.
You know, that serve. Yeah.
Can I tell you one brief story about that? Just, I promise I'll give you 1 second. One brief story. The cohort had this, wonderful blinding flash of the obvious when we're thinking about systems thinking and we're doing boundary spanning type work, and they know this needs to happen in the organization, and they know it needs to happen around their projects, and they realize they're not doing it themselves across the cohorts. So you're dead right, we were learning around systems awareness at multiple levels, and we had this set round where they had these ashen faces where they realized that they had been ignoring that in fact they were not working across their own system, their cohort system.
And therein lies some of the, the coaching in relation to not only the opposites, but the near enemy, is that, I am part of the near enemy move. Apart from the opposite is, what is the move into systems awareness, is that I am actually part of the system. I am part of the whole. I have responsibility in this part of the whole. So where it's much easier from protecting on the outside to look in and to actually criticize or to make, to find fault, or to create a distance and to not have any skin in the game. Part of the move here is to actually own that I am a part of this, and that's what I heard you do with them, and with one of the leaders who was high in arrogance, as an example, is, part of that process was speak 50% less and add 50% more value when they do speak, and that's again, creating a shift in how am I showing up and how am I adding value in this space. Very powerful move and shift when people can actually access the gifts that come with protecting, the confidence, the perspective taking, the ability to see things that others don't see, the fast mind, the incredibly fast mind, but not do it from the space of holding my own self-worth and my identity and my fear and the safety that comes with, and not letting go of the knowingness. You know, I am, and I love what you called them, Marion, the activist experts, you know. And when I can let go of that and then lean into and become curious about other perspectives, I actually learn more. The system learns more. The people around me begin to learn more. So we see the shift and the move from protecting through to systems awareness. Does that make sense? So, and I always love to end with this. David, you mentioned earlier on Pema Chodron, and I love ending with this one, that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. So curious about how many of us, you know, are finding, leaning into systems awareness and recognizing tonight through Marion's beautiful description, her sharing of her wisdom, that you know, that there are areas that maybe we can lean into and we can nudge into, and that there are more pathways that we can walk in this. So Marion, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Total pleasure.
It was fun preparing with you, and it was just a joy listening to you sharing this evening. And I would like to, I know we've gone over time slightly, it's 8:33 in Australian Eastern Standard Time, and I would invite, if anybody would like to stay on the webinar for a few more minutes, we can invite a few more questions. For those of you that are leaving, I will remind you that our final webinar in this series of Deep Dive Around the Circle is on Wednesday, the 19th of November, which is about 3 weeks away from now, and that will be on self-awareness. And we have two more of our TLC community members will be joining us, Joe Flynn and Sinjin Mile, to share their wisdom and experience around self-awareness. So, shall we go back to any questions, any comments? I know Huijing from Beijing has actually written us a question, and it's been sitting there for a while. So thank you for being patient. And the question is, are there certain personality traits which tend to inhibit the buildup of systems awareness? For example, judging in the MBTI framework. And how does someone with such a high tendency, like, for example, judging, overcome that? Any thoughts, any ideas on that, Marion?
Are you asking that of me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that high judging, so that in the MBTI framework, that tendency to foreclose, the tendency to shut down, the tendency to want to know the answer rather than the questions. You know, of course, as we all know, it has its strengths in certain areas. But I would agree that I think that tendency can inhibit the spaciousness that's required for systems awareness. And I think that you know, and you and I haven't talked about this, Roma, but I'm thinking that high judging probably would show up in components. It's probably going to show up in controlling. In particular, I think in terms of the, you know, it depends on what goes with it, whether it would also show up in arrogance, but I'm thinking it would show up in controlling. And so I do think that, in my own view, is that drivenness can be an inhibitor around systems awareness, and I do think high judging can be an inhibitor as well.
Yeah, and I do know from my own Myers-Briggs profile with a fairly clear judging preference, that there is that what can sometimes shut down that curiosity and the perspective taking and the patience is the need for closure.
Yeah,
you know. So and I would dare say that does come out of my controlling and my protecting tendencies. Marion, there are a couple of other questions. One was, and I think there's an easy one, it was how long did this process take? And another question was from David, and then one from Diane was, is there a follow-up planned in terms of, you know, that leadership circle remeasure? And then there are a couple of other questions. So did you want to answer those two quickly?
So the process, the larger process of the program was a 10-month program. My subgroup was, you know, all of the subgroups, the 3 subgroups were working together over from March until July of this year. So whatever that is, 3-4 month process. And there isn't a plan on doing a follow-up TLC with this group, but we will, with the introduction now of the Pulse. We will in future programs introduce the Pulse so that we do get a post-assessment, if not of the whole TLC, at least of some components of it, not just a pre-assessment.
Beautiful. Okay, and Diane asked another question. She's just wondering, across the whole project, were there any noticeable differences in profiles across national cultures, like in Marion's group, and across the other groups in the program?
Yeah, so this particular organization doesn't have a strong cross-cultural component to it. So
right.
It wasn't something that showed up.
Okay, beautiful. And then Ian asked a question. Curious about the role of leader D, the female.
Well, look, this was one of the good news stories. This was such a lovely thing. She's great. The guys gave her, when we did our watch out call out session, they gave her the most stunning feedback about her capabilities and the contribution she made to the group. And I've been coaching her subsequently. She had a different coach during the program, but I've been because I'd had that work with her in the group, I've been coaching her subsequently. And she's been promoted just towards the end of the program. She was promoted, and she's now owning her capability for the first time. So she and I are having discussions about whether she would go on and consider herself for a CEO type role. So there's been a huge trend. So she's gone into her new role, into an exceedingly difficult role. She works in the technology space. She's gone into an exceedingly difficult role, and she has moved from sort of being a happy number 2 to being far more, with the work that I'm doing with her at the moment, to being far more authoritative in the kind of recommendations that she makes. And, you know, she's far more, I don't know where she'll go, because it will depend on what she wants from her life. But there's been significant change, and the peer coaching was a great contribution to that.
Wow. Wow, fabulous. There are no other questions, I don't think, at this point in time. Is there anybody else that would like to put up their hand as we bring this session to a close? I don't think so.
No, it's all quiet, right?
Marion. It's all very quiet, yes. Well, thank you again, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks' time, if you can join us for the final webinar of the year, Self-Awareness. And again, our deep gratitude to you, Marion. Loved working with you. And
thank you. Likewise, I learned heaps in the process. It was great to do the work. I learned heaps in doing the work for this session, so it was great to be able to do it.
Beautiful. Well, so I will bid you all, as they say in Japanese, sayonara, if it has to be so, and until next time. So thank you again, and wish you a great rest of the week. Bye for now, everybody.
Good night.
Good
Bye,
night,
everybody.
everyone.
Good night. Marion, would you stay on?
Sure.
Great. Thanks.